In 1914, Australia and England played in a famous and dramatic test series, with the last test being played here at the SCG, known as the Rorke's Drift Test. The name comes from a battle where a heavily depleted British force had won even when outnumbered. But as those games were being played out, political events overseas were unfolding, which would eventually lead to the catastrophe of the First World War. Australia was a nation of 5 million people, and about 400,000 men and women enlisted. Many never returned, and some of those who did were broken beyond repair. As the most popular football code in New South Wales and Queensland, Rugby League felt the impact as much as any other part of society, and it would never be the same again.
Rugby League commenced in the north of England on the 29th of August 1895 when the Northern Union seceded from the Rugby Football Union over the issue of broken time payments. When the first All Blacks toured England in 1905, they saw this new code of professional rugby and brought that idea back to the Antipodes, and that inspired Albert Henry Baskerville, who then planned the first professional All Black tour in 1907. The news that that tour was to take place inspired James Giltinan, as well as the great cricketer Victor Trumper and politician Henry Hoyle, to start organising the birth of Rugby League in Sydney.
One of the fundamental issues was player insurance. Bluey Burden, the Sydney player who broke his collarbone, was unable to work, and he was typical of a lot of examples of guys who were injured or who had to give up jobs to tour to play rugby union. So they'd heard about this game in England where you could actually get insurance and compensation for time away from work. So it wasn't necessarily chasing dollars, it was chasing insurance.
The main things that popularised rugby league in Australia were the Kangaroos-Wallabies matches in 1909, where the Wallabies were enticed to play the 13-a-side game. They effectively became professional, so it was the whole movement of Wallaby players to the Rugby League code, which gave Rugby League a massive boost. Followed in 1910 by the arrival of the Englishmen. Huge crowds greeted the games, played in Sydney and also in Brisbane.
Well, after its establishment in 1907 in Sydney, Rugby League had spread throughout New South Wales and Queensland, and by 1914 had become the biggest sport in both those states, with a footprint that was going to grow in years to come.
In 1914, the English team toured Australia. They played in Sydney, they played in South Australia, where they defeated South Australia 101-0, which is still somewhat of a record. They played 4 games in Queensland. Now, the idea was they then go back, they played 2 tests in Sydney, and then go to New Zealand and come back 6 weeks later and play the 3rd test in Melbourne. The New South Wales Rugby League needed to cash in on the success of that tour. There was a lot of opposition from Rugby Union and also Aussie Rules. And so they asked the English to play essentially a few days later. In fact, they almost forced them to. And the English were pretty upset about that. So they were very fired up about that game. They came out all guns blazing.
The 3rd test became famous as the Rorke's Drift Test because England at one stage were reduced to 9 men on the field and won the game 14 points to 6, and with it, the series 2-1.
My father was Jack Bluey Watkins. He was born in 1893. He was educated at Surrey Hills Public, and from there he moved to the Sydney Morning Herald as a copy boy. He started playing rugby league in 1912. In 1913, he was in the successful Eastern Suburbs Premiership side, and in 1914, he was invited by the New South Wales Rugby League to go to Melbourne and play against England. In that same year, he also played a test against England in Australia. And one of the things that was a little bit funny was that they all wore belts with buckles on them. So Dad's ears were slightly cauliflowered from packing down as a lock. However, he told me at one stage that he got his mother to sew some elastic in his pants. I only wish he'd patented the idea.
As the Ashes series was ending, news came through of an assassination in Sarajevo of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And whilst it seemed to have nothing at all to do with Australia or Rugby League, it led to the outbreak of the First World War.
Well, the Rorke's Drift Test was the last Test match Australia played before the outbreak of the First World War, so the memories of it lasted for 6 years before they played their next international against England in 1920. So it was a very important match. It left very strong impressions at the time, and those impressions have lasted for the next 100 years.
By the time war was declared in Australia, there was a patriotic fervour had built up.
Well, although the general population of Australia responded with enthusiasm to the outbreak of war, for Rugby League it was a challenging situation because there was the whole question of, do we continue? Should we just suspend our competition to prove how patriotic we are, like the Union had done? Or do we live in a more practical world and continue until circumstances are such that it was not practical to continue anymore?
The previous conflict Australia had fought in was the Boer War, and there were still plenty of veterans of that war would have been in their 30s, but they would have had no idea just how big and catastrophic and horrible this thing would have turned out to be.
Your committee impresses upon players and adherent to the league that it is their duty to respond to the Empire's call by enlisting, and if that is not practicable, by actively participating in training, in drill and in rifle shooting, so that when the call becomes more imperative, they will step into the ranks as trained soldiers. New South Wales Annual Report, 1914.
The footballers of the time, a lot of them viewed it as a great experience and a great stunt, they called it, over in England. It was the time of their lives. They thought it was a big game, and in fact, one journalist described it as the greatest game of all, the war. And that was later picked up by Rugby League, of course, and devoted to the sport. But in those days, it was considered a great stunt to go over and participate in a war in a foreign land, and little did they know what they were getting themselves into.
Well, his full name was James Patrick Redmond, but he was known as either Pony or Tony. He was born in Glebe in 1890 to Thomas and Margaret. He went to Glebe School, and from Glebe School he then joined the Glebe Rugby Union Club, played for them for a couple of seasons, and then went over to play for Glebe. And he played for Glebe from 1911 to 1913, 1922 to 23, 66 games. He played predominantly in the second row, sometimes lock, and he represented, and an outstanding goal kicker. I think from memory from Glebe, in his 66 games, he kicked 45 goals and scored 10 tries. He was one of the first to enlist in the First World War in the Australian Naval and Military Expedition Force, which went to German New Guinea. It was over in a week. They knocked out the German radio station that was thought to give the German Navy an advantage. He then went to Gallipoli, where he was seriously injured in October 1915 at Chocolate Hill at Gallipoli. He was then repatriated to a Birmingham hospital for about 2 months or so, where he then started writing in 1916 various letters back to Australia, referring to his discussions, meetings in the battlefields with various footballers like Tommy Gleeson, who'd gone from Glebe to play for Huddersfield.
I have met and had some good yarns of old times with Tom Gleeson, Jimmy Devereaux, Sid Dean, Viv Farnsworth and Tom McCabe, the forward who played with Glebe League in 1908. Gleeson wishes to be remembered to all. Cooey to all old pals. The referee, June 14, 1916.
About 30 years ago, I knew a number of people that all knew Tony. They all spoke for him very highly. Jack Flitcroft described him as an exemplary citizen and a very sunny character before the war. But after the war, he returned a very changed personality.
Albert Richmond Compton, or Bluey to his mates, was a coach smith from Leichhardt who had played in Leichhardt's 1911 third grade premiership winning team alongside the likes of George Wheatley, Lyle Wall and several other well-known first grade players. He enlisted when war broke out, served on both Gallipoli and on the Western Front. He recorded his adventures and experiences in a diary that is now held by the State Library of New South Wales.
Issue of beer today for the men. And didn't they jump with joy at the news when they heard same? They have not seen the sight of beer since we embarked. It is issued on these conditions. If a man wants any, he has to pay 3p. 1 bottle costs 6p. 2 men have to share 1 bottle between them. Albert Compton, Diary, March 22nd, 1915.
Edward Larkin was born in Raymond's Terrace in 1880, and when the family moved to Sydney, he was educated at St Joseph's College. He played rugby union at school, and he played rugby union when he left school, and he was actually in the first All-Australian rugby union team that played New Zealand in a test match in 1903. He was a friend of Victor Trumper's, and I think that's why he became involved in Rugby League. In 1909, he became the first paid full-time secretary of the league, and was instrumental in bringing the rugby union tourists over to Rugby League in 1909, which gave the new code a vast number of very high-quality players. In 1910, he was responsible for organising the very first tour down here by the Northern Union when James Lomas brought his team down. In 1913, he became the very first Labour member to become elected to Parliament on the North Shore when he won the seat at Willoughby. On the 4th of August 1914, when war was declared, he had a crisis. He felt he had to do his duty. He had no reason to enlist. He was married with 2 small children, but felt he couldn't ask players and young men to go and fight for their country if he sat at home doing nothing. He left Australia on the Afric in October of 1914, continued his training, and whilst on board ship, he launched a daily newspaper called The Kangaroo, out of its element, and copies of that newspaper still exist in the State Library in Sydney. In 1915, he sailed to the Dardanelles, and on the 25th of April 1915, he went ashore at the beaches at Gallipoli, and within an hour, he was dead. And with his passing, Rugby League lost one of its greatest ever administrators, and if we believe politicians, the state lost a future Labour Premier.
Stan Carpenter was one of the original Newcastle players who played in the Sydney Metropolitan Premiership in 1908 and 09. He was the captain of the Newcastle team. They used to travel to Sydney every weekend by train and participate against the Sydney teams. And Carpenter was a very talented player. He represented Australia in 1909 against the Maoris. And later, after enlisting with the AIF, he was a stretcher bearer. He was at the landing at Gallipoli and performed some quite amazing deeds under heavy fire, rescuing wounded soldiers as they came off the boats. He was recommended for a Victoria Cross on 2 occasions, once there and once in France.
At Pozieres during period 22-25 July 1916, this NCO throughout the operation showed the most remarkable gallantry under the most trying circumstances. And though the shelling was unprecedented in severity, nothing seemed to daunt the matchless courage of this NCO. Time after time was he seen way out in no man's land, collecting and tending the wounded. There is no doubt that it was through his efforts that so few of our battalion wounded are missing. Officers and men are unanimous in their admiration of him. 1st of August 1916.
And she lived to a very to old age. She lived to 60 until 1962, and he died the day that England played Newcastle in Newcastle.
So George Duffin was quite a famous Queensland player pre-First World War. He actually came from Sydney. His father was from Manly, and he was an original Sydney West player. So he was an inaugural member of Rugby League in Sydney. And then we're not quite sure what reasons he moved into Queensland. It could have been a job transfer, or he may have been encouraged by the game starting in Queensland. But in 1909, a club competition began in Brisbane, and he joined a very famous club called Valleys Football Club, which then became Valleys Toombul for a brief time, and was one of the most successful clubs in the old Brisbane Rugby League competition right up until well into the 1980s. In 1910 through to 1913, he represented Queensland 18 times, including captaining Queensland against New Zealand. Now, he was the only 6 players from Valleys captained Queensland. The last one was Wally Lewis in 1983. So George has a fairly prestigious place in the game in Queensland. He also represented Australia twice during that time. He returned to Sydney in 1914, and word has it he played for Tramways, a metropolitan club, before enlisting. He enlisted on the 1st of March 1915. One of the many rugby league players who did go early in the war. Many went later, after 1916, but he was one of the ones that went early. Member of the 18th Battalion from New South Wales. and was killed, unfortunately, I think on the 22nd of August 1915, attacking Hill 60. His grave was never found, one of many, many Australian soldiers, Anzac troops, whose name is commemorated at Gallipoli, but there's no known grave.
The 18th had been ashore 3 days. These new men were big and rosy-cheeked. They had never been under fire and were full of hope. They arrived a few hundred yards west of Hill 60 at dawn on August 22nd. Their officers were called to a conference and told they were to attack with bombs and bayonets only. But they had no bombs, an officer interjected. Well, they'd just have to do their best without them. They charged the Turkish trenches, 750 strong, and came out with 383 casualties, half of them dead. Hill 60 was still unconquered and a new battalion had been ruined. Troops were short and compromises inevitable. There was still something contemptible about the way the 18th had been sent out to die. Les Carlon, Gallipoli.
Frank Cheadle was born Francis Bowman Cheadle. He was born in 1885 in Wollongong, south of Sydney. Frank was born to William and Catherine Cheadle. So when Frank was young, he moved up to the Marrickville area and he went to the Fort Street High School. He was a really talented sportsman, actually. He was very good at cricket and he was a good runner as well. But rugby union was his passion at that time. And so he went on to play rugby union with the Newtown Rugby Union Club. And just when he was about to get picked for the national side, a new code developed, and that was the Rugby League. So Frank was reportedly the first person to sign up for the Rugby League, and he joined the famous Newtown Jets side. So in 1910, he retired. He'd played his tests overseas, and I think he felt like he was done. His father had passed away, and so Frank was sort of relied on to bring a bit of income into his family. So he decided to take on a full-time salesman job to help his mother with that. In January of 1915, he enlisted to go overseas to fight for Australia in the war. So later on in 1915, in August, Frank was shipped out and landed in Gallipoli, where he went on to fight in Hill 60 battle. It was a pretty disastrous battle, so they weren't there very long, but Frank was given the promotion of second lieutenant in the 18th Battalion. They were evacuated some months later. He went to France, to the Western Front. While he was there, he went on a scouting party with a number of people. Frank was leading the scouting group, and unfortunately he was hit by a sniper in the head and was killed. And obviously it's had a big effect on my family and my brothers and sisters and my children now. To know that, we had someone who went and fought for Australia for us and, kept us free to live as we are today. So it's very important.
My grandfather, Herbert, who was Herbert Thomas Bolt, but he was always called Nutsy, that was his nickname. And so he was born in Camden Street, Enmore. He was the youngest of 7 children, and his parents were Robert and Mary. And so he went to Newtown Public School, and when he left there, he worked as a brickmaker, and he did very well there.
This is to certify that the bearer, Herbert Bolt, has been employed by me for a period of 4 years, starting as a lad and working his way up right through the yard. He is a good, hard-working, strong fellow and has given us every satisfaction during the whole time. He leaves me to better himself, and I wish him every success. J. Gentle, Esquire, April 21, 1914.
He met Jenny Hughes. They got married and they had one little baby girl, my mother, and they named her Mary Monica, but he always called her his little Mona. He played for the Newtown Blue Bags, and I believe he played about 52 games, and he represented New South Wales in 1913 against Queensland in 2 matches, of which they won both. He played centre, that was where he played, and I believe he was very good. When Herbert went to war, he kept a diary, which I have, and so reading this diary, he said that he was a very good boxer. He did some boxing on the ship as he was heading towards Europe, Egypt, and he actually won 10 shillings for winning the boxing bout on the ship. He also says that he was very good at shooting. They had to do practice with their guns, and he said he was a very good shooter. It was on the morning of the 20th of July 1916. Herbert was in the trenches with his mate, Frank Johnston.
We joined the 55th Battalion at Tel El Kebir. On the morning of July 20th, 1916, at about 5 a.m. in Fleuberg, in the communications trench near the first line of German trenches, as we were retiring from the third line of German trenches. He and I were close to one another when we were attacked by the Germans. He got more than 6 of them with his bayonet and the butt of his rifle. When he got a bullet through his head, he fell instantly, being killed outright. He was as game as any man and was a well-known Newtown footballer. Frank Johnson, April 3rd, 1917.
Well, after it was confirmed that Nutsy Bolt had been killed at Fromelles, the Newtown club organised a fundraiser for his widow and baby child, and it's a measure of how much they thought of Nutsy and how much he had meant to the club. It's a very nice touch that they were able to organise to march through the streets of Newtown, down King Street and down to Erskineville Oval, all dressed out in what passed for fancy dress of the day, banging drums and trying to create as much noise to attract people down there as they could, because the more people that went, the greater chance of making more money for the family. One of the events they organised down at Erskineville Oval involved racing around the oval, and then once you crossed the finish line, you had to pull apart an effigy of the Kaiser, which was basically like a scarecrow. So they had a bit of fun with it as well, as is shown by the photos that remain from the occasion. But the money that was raised was intended to be used towards the purchase of a family home for Nutsy's widow and baby daughter, very much like the ideals of the Legacy organisation and the Men of League. And it just goes to show that Rugby League has a proud history of always looking after its own. Well, for many, many years, the Bolt family had no closure and had no idea of what had happened to Nutsy, and yet in 2010, through the remarkable efforts of a Melbourne schoolteacher, Lambus and Glasos, the bodies had been finally tracked down. They had been identified through DNA of remaining family members, and Nutsy and several hundred of those who died alongside him that night were able to finally get the burial that they certainly deserved.
I'm Leslie Perry, and I'm the granddaughter of George Cummins, who was born on the 17th of June, 1886. A gorgeous man and a big man, 6 feet tall and very large, and large in character as well. He was a teacher originally, and then went to the war and came back and did medicine. But sprinkled in amongst this was his wonderful football career. He played for Balmain, and then he played for New South Wales, and then after the war he came back and played for Sydney University.
Big George Cummins, sculler, boxer, pianist and a host of other things, is already in rare fettle. His pace for a big man is surprising. Rugby League record, May 3, 1913.
My grandfather was a wonderful kicker, and all the reports in the papers that I've read and that I've kept report that he could kick from halfway, and that he was a very strong kicker, and anywhere on the field he seemed to be able to kick. And I think this was a wonderful thing to have if you're a footballer. When he went to war, he was captured at Fromelles, and I think it was very fortunate that he was captured at Fromelles. He was in the second wave, and so he was captured, and that saved him from being killed, really. So we're very fortunate that he was captured. He was sent to camp, of course, and that's where he spent the rest of his war life. But I know grandmother was very distressed about it all, and I know there were lots of telegrams that went backwards and forwards. It must have been a terrible time for her, because she had a young baby by then, and who her grandfather hadn't seen. I know he was very damaged when he came back, physically. Mentally, I don't think he could damage grandfather. But he was certainly physically very damaged, and that's why he retrained and did medicine.
Well, there were other rugby league players who were captured and served as prisoners of war during the First World War, including Robert Wright Griffiths, a Newcastle centre who was captured and prisoner of war with the Turks for the remainder of the campaign, and also Albert Richmond Compton, who was captured at 2nd Bullecourt.
Bob Tidyman was a very talented Eastern Suburbs centre, originally born in Townsville, but he arrived in Sydney as a young fella and made his mark in rugby league with the Eastern Suburbs club. He was a teammate of Daly and Wally Messenger and Sandy Pearce and great players like Dan Frawley and Jack Bluey Watkins, and he enlisted in the AIF in 1915 and lost his life on the Somme just as winter was setting in 1916. His body was never found, and obviously it caused great anguish for his family, who were desperate for reports on what may have become of him over the months. And that was a common story in World War I, not only for footballers' families, but for families of many, many soldiers whose bodies were never located.
So the home front in Australia between 1914 and 1980, the duration of the war, was one of great political turbulence and class conflict on a scale unique in Australian history.
Well, the game continued during World War I. It was a very contentious issue whether sport should be played while our soldiers were fighting overseas, but it was viewed that it was very important for morale at home to keep an entertainment happening on weekends for local people. There were a lot of workers involved in essential industries who couldn't join the war effort, so they were still at home, and a lot of them were rugby league players as well.
The league heads have decided to differ from their one-time enemy and have decided that as they have the necessary dough, players and grounds, and tens of thousands of supporters, that there is still time between drills to have regular Saturday afternoon football. And it is significant that nearly all the union players who think they are worth their salt in first-grade teams are nibbling around for a game with the various district league clubs. Already, quite a number of the leading lily whites have signed on, and the rest are yet to prove their worth. Sydney Sportsman, April 7, 1915.
So it was viewed as a very important pastime, a recreation, a way to forget about what was happening overseas as well. And so rugby league continued, and not only did they continue, but they raised money for war efforts as well. They raised enough money in 1916 to buy a war ambulance that was used by the troops, and various other measures. There was a Belgian relief fund that they pledged money towards as well, and so they did their bit for the war effort while continuing their competitions.
Well, clearly the giant in the glebe ranks was Frank Birch. Frank played from glebe 1911 to 1922 and 1926. He scored about 146 tries. In 1916, together with Reagan and Bert Gray, he sought to enlist. He was rejected on the basis that he had, as they called it, a speech impediment. Frank evidently had a pronounced stutter. And, I mean, what can you say? The guy was about 13 stone 2. He was just a magnificent specimen who took about 3 blokes to bring him down when he was fullback. So, and they rejected him. It's just ridiculous to say, what was he going to stutter at the Germans or something? Yeah.
Well, there were 2 junior league players who won the Victoria Cross, the highest honour that any soldier can win in the Empire, during the First World War. George Julian Howe from Enfield in Sydney was a junior league player with Enfield Feds, and Paddy Bugden from Alstonville near Lismore was also a junior league player.
The story of how Sergeant Howe won the Victoria Cross is told in the official dispatches. He displayed the most conspicuous bravery. Seeing a party of enemy likely to outflank a battalion, Howe, on his own initiative, single-handed and while exposed to heavy bomb and rifle fire, climbed up on top of the parapet and proceeded to bomb the enemy, pressing them back along the trench. Having exhausted his stock of bombs, he attacked the enemy with the bayonet until he was severely wounded. Howe's prompt action and gallant conduct in the face of superior numbers was witnessed by a whole battalion and greatly inspired the men in the subsequent successful counter-attacks. Sydney Morning Herald, Tuesday, January 1st, 1918.
One of the great examples of a rugby league player who excelled serving Australia in the First World War was Patrick Bugden from Alstonville in northern New South Wales. He was the son of a hotel keeper. He volunteered quite young, and he volunteered in Brisbane. Like a lot of the guys from that region, Brisbane was closer than Sydney. He volunteered for the 31st Battalion, which was predominantly a Queensland/Victorian battalion. To this day, the 31st Battalion is based in North Queensland, in Townsville. And Patrick Bugden served on the Western Front and died saving the life of several of his colleagues and was awarded the Victoria Cross for doing so.
I look forward to returning home, to seeing my beloved family, of regaining some form of normality. I never thought I would see the day where I longed to work behind a bar once more. I don't know whether I'm going to live or die. I just hope for the best. Paddy Bugnan, diary entry, May 16, 1917.
By the time they got to France, the casualties were just ridiculous. We lost 23,000 people at Pozieres. We had 5,000 casualties, 5,500 in one night at Fromelles, including about 2,000 killed. That is just incredibly difficult to comprehend even today. So the Australian Army, the Australian Imperial Force needed troops. So the government under Billy Hughes decided to bring in a plebiscite to look at conscription.
Hughes had promised Britain to fulfil a quota that he was unable to fill. So his response was to introduce conscription of single men without dependents. And they had the first referendum was held on the 28th of October 1916.
The conscription issue became so divisive and emotional in the community. Some sporting newspapers at the time saw it as a two-horse race, with Billy Hughes and those who were pro-conscription as one horse and the anti-conscription forces as the other.
In spite of the fact that the two cups were on the bill of fare, the great referendum stakes listed to start on Saturday the 8th mostly attracted the attention of sportsmen. The stakes at issue were the greatest that have ever been run for south of the equator. The competitors were Billy Hughes' piebald gelding Conscription, Alice Australia's white horse Anti. A reference to the stud book shows that Conscription, a flea-bitten piebald, is by tyrant out of slavery, running right back to Stone Age ignorance. The lineage is aristocratic enough, but is dreadfully inbred. The breeding of Anti is given as by liberty out of fair play and runs on clean lines to common sense and justice. Two crosses of the right is might blood, giving soundness to a pedigree that would delight any student of breeding. Progress reports concerning the contest continue to come to hand, all showing that Anti is distancing Conscription. So far as it is possible to forecast, Anti should win by enough to found a new state. Thomas Manfred Rose, Sportsman, Wednesday, November the 1st, 1916.
So in Queensland, it was a Labor government, and the perception's always been now that a Labor government anti-conscription didn't mean they were anti-war. Didn't mean they were anti-Australia or anti-AIF. They volunteered in their droves, and the Brisbane West Club were a classic example. Predominantly Roman Catholic, a Labor stronghold. Many of those players fought in the First World War, including their captain, Dobbin Hickey, another guy called Jack Quinlan, who lost his arm at Pozieres and became famous after the war as the one-armed referee, Vincent Casey. There was a whole stack of those guys.
Certainly in the glebe club, by 1916, there were 66 glebe first, second and third graders enlisted. By the end of the war, 95.
But generally speaking, Queensland and New South Wales voted conscription down. Extremely controversial issue which almost split the nation. The story of Billy Hughes became quite famous when he stopped in Warwick in Queensland and made an impromptu speech. Two members of the crowd disagreed with him and threw an egg at him. Now, the folklore is their last name was Brosnan, which means they have a link to our modern-day supercoach Wayne Bennett, whose ancestors included the Brosnans.
The very big strike was began at the beginning of 1917. It started in the tramways over various methods of payment. It spread to lots of other transport industries and involved 173,000 workers, and something like 5 million working days were lost. So conditions were very hard at home for people. And of course, it was the two failed referendum that really created great tensions and polarised the population. In 1917, Dan Luddow Davies came down from Newcastle Wests. He was a 22-year-old burly centre. Glebe was expecting big things of. But when he came down, he stayed with a relative at Annandale. And that, of course, under the residential rule, he was required to be eligible to row. He had to live within Glebe municipality. In the very first round, in May 1917, Glebe beat Annandale 26-5 and Davies scored a try. The secretary of the Annandale club, Lennon, appealed to the Rugby League that he was in breach of the residential rules living in Annandale. The league investigated, found it correct, deducted the 2 points from Glebe and suspended Dan Lado Davies for life. He then returned to his old team in Newcastle West, notwithstanding that he'd been suspended for life, and by the consent of the teams playing in that Newcastle competition, they agreed that he should play. The Rugby League became aware of that, and as a result, all those teams were banned. The effect of all this was that it split the Newcastle competition in two. Then Glebe was to play Balmain on the 21st of July 1917 at the Sydney Cricket Ground. And as you know, in those days, each team would get 1/3 of the gate, so it was important. You'd get a much bigger pay packet for each player playing at the SCG than for playing on some suburban ground. Then the Rugby League decided to shift the game from the SCG to Birchgrove Oval, Balmain's home ground. The Glebe players were outraged at what they saw as clear bias by the Rugby League against them, and they decided that they would forfeit the game against Balmain the coming Saturday, the 21st, as an indication of the bias or the partial way they'd been treated by the New South Wales Rugby League. As a result of that, the Rugby League suspended the whole Glebe team for the entirety of the 1918 for the following season. But before the season began in May 1918, following appeals by the Glebe players, they were able to play during the 1918 season.
George Wheatley was a leading first-grade player at the time. He played for Balmain and North Sydney, and he was an engineer in World War I, and his family had the great anguish to see his name listed among the dead. In, of all places, a sporting newspaper, the referee said that he had lost his life in France in 1917, and the family had not received any notice from any official party. They were frantic, trying to find information. It transpired in a year or so later, Wheatley had been married late in the war in the town hall at Rouen in northern France, not far from the front lines. Not sure whether his disappearance was related to him getting married, but he married a local girl. She was the daughter of a French storekeeper. They arrived back in Australia and lived in Australia for another 50 years in Gladesville until they both passed away. So a love story amongst the horror and tragedy of war.
The war ended on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m.
Some men did not enlist, just as many in the rugby union did not. Many noted players were either killed or wounded, and very many of the lower grades went under as true men and patriots to their country. Many of the statements made about men not enlisting are superficial, and often by men who did not enlist themselves. The fact of the Rugby League having kept its game going decently during the war is misinterpreted by some people as disclosing lack of patriotism, but that is nonsense. The referee, August 13, 1920.
The Kangaroos who toured in 1921, some of them had fought in the war, amongst them Jack Bluey Watkins, and at his first opportunity he went back to France to visit some of the places where he'd served and where some of the tragedies had occurred.
A little bit unfortunately, when he was in France, he lost his younger brother in France as well. So that was a bit of a sad thing for him. And I believe on the 1921 tour, they all went back to France to look up the graves and honour their friends that had died in the war.
It must have been an extremely poignant time for someone who had served and was now back there touring with an Australian Rugby League team to see what had happened in those years before.
On the way home from his kangaroo tour of England, they did stop off in Hawaii, and I had read correspondence somewhere that he had surfed with the famous Duke Kahanamayuku, and the paper put it, Dad showed him a few tricks.
Well, the story of Duncan Thompson is one that's fascinated me for many years. One of Australia's most famous halfbacks. He played after serving in the war. He was critically injured in a place called Dernancourt in France, in northern France in 1918, and apparently the first thing that he said when he was discovered was, will I be able to play again? Well, he was given the news by doctors that he would never play rugby league. He might be able to play tennis. He eventually returned to play in Ipswich, played some cricket first, and then plucked up the courage to play rugby league. And he starred again for Ipswich and for Queensland and for Australia, won premierships with North Sydney, and became one of the game's great coaches and an influential coach whose strategies are still in use today by none less than Wayne Bennett. He taught a system of coaching called the contract system, and Bennett has used that throughout his career as a top-grade coach. So his influence has touched rugby league for more than a century.
The kangaroo tours of the 1920s and particularly 1933 made a big point of visiting the Australian graves on the Western Front and places where the Australian Imperial Force had been based and trained in England. In 1933, very significant kangaroo tour. It was the first one to play in France and help establish the game in France. While they were there, many wreaths were laid on the Western Front, Villers-Bretonneux and other places, Pozieres. One of the players of that tour was a Queensland forward by the name of Henry Denny, and he was the only member of the tour at 33 years of age who had been a veteran of the First World War. And there's quite a few photos of Henry being the one designated to lay the wreath because of his involvement. He was a member of the Light Horse during the First World War.
Rugby league in Australia has always reflected wider social trends and has been the face of the nation through wars, depression and the post-war boom. Thousands of rugby league players and officials from all sorts of clubs enlisted, and they did their bit during World War I. They came from far and wide and were a cosmopolitan lot. There were blokes from cities and towns, every occupation you could think of, and a broad range of nationalities. My great-grandfather was one of these men. Those who stayed at home were also impacted, and there's tragedy and triumph on all sorts of levels. But the more we learn about them, the more we understand and appreciate how the First World War shaped our nation and our game, and why we must uphold our promise to continue to remember them, lest we forget.